You were maybe 7 or 8, sitting in class, playing outside, watching something on TV, and there was a moment, could have been small, could have been nothing to anyone else, where you felt a pull towards something you didn't understand. Not a phase, just a flicker of recognition that the way you saw the world didn't match the way you were told you were supposed to see it. And you did what any kid would do. You filed it away, kept moving, didn't mention it, because nobody around you was talking about it either. My name's Frank, and this one might hit different. Today we're talking about what it was like to grow up gay in Gen X. Not what it turned into, not what the world looks like now, just what it felt like when you were a kid, in a house, in a school, in a neighborhood where nobody said the word, or when they did, it wasn't kind. And the psychology of what that does to someone who's still learning how to tie their shoes. Let's get into it. Here's the thing about being a gay kid in the 70s and 80s. You didn't have context. There was no framework. No one sat you down and said, hey, some people are attracted to the same gender and that's perfectly fine. That conversation didn't exist. Not in most homes, not in most schools, and definitely not on TV, unless it was a punchline. So what did you have? You had a feeling. Researchers have studied this pretty thoroughly, and what they found is that a lot of people who identify as gay or bisexual report their first awareness of same-sex attraction around age 10 or 11. But here's the part people miss. Many of them remember feeling different from their peers even earlier than that, as young as 8, before they even understood what attraction meant. They just knew something about them didn't line up with the other kids. And when you're 8 and you feel different but you can't explain why, you don't go looking for answers, you go looking for camouflage. You studied the kids around you, you figured out what was expected, you watched what boys were supposed to like, how they were supposed to act, what they were supposed to say about girls, and you matched it, or you tried to. Some of you were better at it than others, but the effort was constant. That mental overhead, watching yourself, editing yourself, performing a version of yourself that felt safe, that started young, way before puberty, way before you had a name for what was going on inside you. And that performance cost you something, not because there was anything wrong with you, because pretending takes energy. And kids who are spending their mental bandwidth on hiding don't get to spend it on just being kids. Now let's talk about the house you grew up in, because that's where the real math happened. A lot of Gen X parents who are boomers or late silent generation, they came up in a world where homosexuality was literally classified as a mental disorder. The American Psychiatric Association didn't remove it from the diagnostic manual until 1973, and that vote barely passed. So even after the official label went away, the thinking behind it stuck around for decades. If you were a kid in the late 70s or 80s, your parents probably grew up being told that being gay was a sickness, maybe a sin, maybe both. So when their kids started acting a little different, maybe playing with the wrong toys, maybe not interested in sports, maybe a little too close with a certain friend, a lot of parents didn't respond with curiosity, they responded with correction. And in the 70s and 80s, mental health professionals often backed them up. There was an actual clinical approach at the time where kids who didn't fit typical gender behavior were diagnosed with something called gender identity disorder and put into therapy to make them more masculine or more feminine, not to help them figure out who they were, to fix them. Parents were told their kid could be corrected. Some of those kids spent years in treatment, and the ones who came out later often said those years didn't change who they were, it just taught them that who they were was the problem. That's the psychology right there. When the people who are supposed to protect you were the same people trying to reshape you, you learn a very specific lesson. Love is conditional. It's tied to performance. And if they see the real you, you might lose the one thing that keeps you safe. Now, not every house was like that. That's worth saying. Some parents noticed and said nothing, not out of cruelty, but because they genuinely didn't know what to do. Some parents suspected and decided to just let their kid figure it out. And a small number of parents actually said something supportive, even if they were fumbling through it. Research on family reactions shows it breaks into rough thirds. About a third of parents respond with acceptance, about a third respond with rejection, and about a third never hear about it at all because their kid never tells them, sometimes not even into their 20s. And for Gen X kids specifically, that last group was big because the incentive to stay quiet was enormous.
Think about what was happening outside the house. In the early 80s, AIDS showed up. And it didn't just show up as a health crisis, it showed up as a branding campaign against gay people. The disease was originally called GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. That was the clinical name, not slang, not graffiti, the name that showed up in medical literature in newspaper headlines. So from the very beginning, the public message was, this disease belongs to gay people. By 1985, Gallup found that 8 out of 10 Americans believed most people with AIDS were gay men. By 1986, nearly half of Americans said they were actively avoiding places where gay people might be. And by 1987, roughly half the country said people with AIDS had brought it on themselves. Now imagine you're 12 years old. You're sitting in a living room and the news is on. You don't fully understand what AIDS is, but you understand the tone. You understand the faces people make when they talk about it. You pick up on the connection the adults are drawing, that being gay means being sick, that it might mean dying. And you're sitting there quietly, knowing that the thing they're scared of, that thing lives inside you. You didn't choose the timing, you didn't choose the cultural moment, but the message found you anyway. And it taught you something that went deeper than fear. It taught you that the world considers people like you dangerous, not just wrong, dangerous, the kind of person other people avoid. For a kid who's already watching themselves, already performing, already hiding, that's another lock on the door. So what did you do with all of that? You adapted, because that's what kids do. Some of you got really good at being invisible, not just quiet, invisible. You learned how to occupy space without drawing attention. You learned how to answer questions without revealing anything. You sat at lunch tables and laughed at jokes about gay people because laughing meant no one was looking at you. Some of you went the other direction. You got loud, you got tough, you dated people you weren't attracted to. You overcompensated in every direction because the louder you were about being normal, the less likely anyone was to look underneath it. And some of you just went internal. You built an entire inner world, books, music, art, imagination, places where you didn't have to perform, places where you could feel things without anyone seeing. A lot of gay Gen X kids became sharp observers of human behavior, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. When your safety depends on reading a room, you get very good at reading rooms.
Now let's talk about friends, because that's where it got complicated in a different way. A lot of you had close friendships with other kids, real ones, but there was always a wall, always a part of yourself you couldn't share. And here's what's psychologically interesting about that. When you're a kid and you're consistently withholding a part of your identity from the people you care about, you start to believe that the full version of you is unlovable. Not because anyone said it in those exact words, but because the math adds up in your head. They like this version of me. If they knew the real version, they might not. That's not something an adult told you. That's something you taught yourself based on everything you were absorbing from the world around you. The silence in your house, the jokes at school, the news on TV, the word gay being used as the worst insult a kid could throw at another kid, which, by the way, became common slang in the 80s. It wasn't even about sexuality half the time. It was just a shorthand for bad or wrong or weak. But if you were a kid who actually was gay, every time someone used that word as a weapon, it landed on you, even when it wasn't aimed at you. So who did you have? Who could you actually talk to? For a lot of Gen X kids, the answer was nobody, at least not for a long time. The average age of coming out during the 70s and 80s was around 20. That's not a typo, 20. That means a lot of people spent their entire childhood and adolescence holding this in. Compare that to more recent numbers. By the 2000s, the average dropped to around 14. That gap tells you everything about what the environment looked like. It wasn't that Gen X kids were slower to figure it out. They figured it out at the same age as everyone else. They just didn't feel safe enough to say it until years later. And that gap between knowing and telling, that's where a lot of the psychological weight lived. Because keeping a secret isn't just about not talking. It rewires how you process relationships. You start sorting people into categories, safe and unsafe. You develop a kind of social radar that never turns off. You test conversations before you have them, running scenarios in your head. What would happen if I told this person? And most of the time, the answer you came up with was, don't risk it. That's not paranoia. That's survival strategy, built by a kid in a world that wasn't ready. Here's where it gets interesting from a development standpoint, though, because all of that hiding, all of that watching, it also built something. A lot of Gen X gay kids developed an early understanding of social dynamics that most people don't get until much later, if ever they get it. When you're constantly reading a room, you get smart about people fast. You learn what's real and what's performance. You develop empathy because you know what it feels like to be on the outside looking in. And you build resilience, not the motivational poster kind, but the practical kind. The ability to function under pressure without anyone knowing you're under pressure. None of that erases what it cost, but it's worth naming, because a lot of you have spent a long time thinking of your childhood as something you survived. And maybe it was, but you also built something in the middle of it. You sharpened skills that most people never develop, and you did it before you were old enough to drive. Let's talk about the kids who did find someone, because not everyone was alone. Some of you had that one person, a cousin, a friend from summer camp, a teacher who said something small, so small you might not have even realized it was intentional, that let you know you weren't the only one. Maybe they lent you a book. Maybe they just didn't laugh at the joke. Maybe they looked at you a beat too long after someone said something cruel, and in that look you saw, I see you. Those moments were lifelines, not because they changed your situation, but because they cracked the narrative. They interrupted the story you'd been telling yourself, that nobody could know and still accept you. One person. That's all it took to put a crack in the wall. And the research backs this up. Studies on family acceptance consistently find that having even one supportive person, a parent, a sibling, a teacher, a friend, dramatically changes outcomes for LGBTQ youth. One person shifts the math. It doesn't fix everything, but it gives the kids something to hold on to. Proof that the full version of them is not a liability. Some of you had that person. Some of you didn't find them until later. And some of you became that person for someone else, maybe without even knowing it. Here's the last thing, and then I'm out. Growing up gay in Gen X wasn't one story. It was a million different versions of the same question. Is it safe to be who I am? And for most of you, the answer, at least while you were young, was no. Not because of anything broken inside you, because of the era you were born into, the information that didn't exist yet, the conversations adults were too scared to have, the cultural moment that decided to link your identity to a disease and a punchline in the same decade. You didn't get to be a kid the same way other kids were kids. You were doing double duty, growing up and hiding at the same time. And you did it without a manual, without a community, and often without a single person who understood what you were carrying. That took something. And whatever you built on top of it, that's yours. If this one landed, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.